Well, it's great to have you, Laura, on the Business of Sport podcast with the International Sports Convention. A lot of topics, a lot of meaty topics, from sports governance to diversity inclusion, including also the future of women's and girls football. So really looking forward to this discussion. But let's kick off a starter for three to give our global listeners a bit of background on you, Laura. So where were you born? What interested you at school? And what are your personal sport interests?
Well, I was born in a medium-sized town called Bridgend in South Wales, which is located in between Cardiff and Swansea. And I was brought up there and with my grandparents in the valleys north of Bridgend, in the Llinvi Valley. Went to the local comprehensive school. I went initially to a bilingual school. As some of your listeners might know, Wales has two languages, Welsh and English. And I went to a bilingual school. So some of my education was through the medium of Welsh. And I speak both languages now, by the way. What was I interested in as a child? It won't surprise you to hear that I was absolutely mad on sport from a very young age. I came from quite a sporting family. You know, both my mother and my father were active sports people. My mother was a good track and field athlete, and my dad played tennis and table tennis and golf. So we were always kind of brought up in that environment of watching and playing sport, and the power of sport was communicated to us really, really trenchantly, I think, when we were young children. I've got a younger brother and an older sister. And in school, I carried that forward, really. I played every sport that was on offer. I captained the hockey team and the netball team, and I was a decent, I wouldn't say brilliant, but I was a decent track and field athlete in that I was a sort of good standard club runner at 800 and 1500. And I'd have a go at, long jump and high jump and so on. So it's kind of, all my life, sport has really been quite an important and fundamental part. And then I was also a big sports fan. I mean, my grandfather was the chairman of Maesteg, which is a town in South Wales, Cardiff City Supporters Club, and took me to my first game when I was a toddler, really, when I was probably about 3 or 4. And I really got the bug. I loved everything about the atmosphere in the old Ninian Park in Cardiff. And I went to my first Wales International when I was 4. And everything about watching football appealed to me as well. I mean, it was just men's football that I watched at that point. But I never really thought that it would be different for me to a boy in terms of playing the game. And certainly for a little while, it wasn't. I played football in the street and in the park, mainly with boys. I had a brother and I had lots of male cousins, but I was also friends with boys in the village and in the vicinity. And because I was a half decent player, they were quite happy for me to carry on playing with them, really. So it was only later that I realized that there were some quite fundamental obstacles for girls and for women who wanted to play the game.
Fantastic, a Bluebirds fan. You're a professor at Cardiff University. You've also been the Professor of Governance at Liverpool University for 18 years. So education has obviously been core to your career and your journey. In those early years as such, what further education did you do and why?
So when I left school in Bridgend, I took a year out and I travelled simply because I just thought this might be the best opportunity to travel, really. And I was keen to learn some other languages. I mean, I spoke Welsh and English, but I was keen to improve my other European languages. So I spent 6 months in Paris and 6 months in Rome in Italy, and I learned some Italian. My French was all right anyway, so I improved my French. And then in between, I did some stints as a holiday courier on campsites in France, mainly in the Vendée region of France, which I was lucky enough to revisit. In fact, when Wales were playing in the 2016 Euros, we were able to go as a family and stay in one of the campsites that I'd worked in on our way to Bordeaux. So I took a year out, and then I went to the London School of Economics, LSE, and I studied politics there, or government as they call it, BSc Econ in government. And I was already quite political with a small p, in that I wasn't particularly driven by party politics, but I was interested in the whole philosophy and theory of politics and how people engaged in a democratic environment, but also how decisions were made, the kind of power games and the policy environment. So I did my first degree at LSE, and then I came home and I did my PhD at Cardiff University, which was much more theoretical. It was on kind of theories of communitarian socialism, utopian socialism, Fabianism, and so on. I graduated from Cardiff University, and that was when I took my first proper academic job at Liverpool University, where I spent, the best part of 16 or 17 years, I think. And it was much longer than I'd intended to spend there, but I really fell in love with the city. And in fairness, Liverpool University gave me every opportunity to really develop my professional career and to develop myself, so I've got a lot to be great. I owe them a lot, certainly, because they gave me a huge platform, really, for my academic career. And I'll always be very grateful to the university.
And let's zoom into kind of your expertise, governance. Tell us really the importance of governance generally, and also the importance of sports governance, and how important that is strategically for sports governing bodies and other institutions to have the right structure in place.
Well, sports are businesses, aren't they? And certainly in terms of national governing bodies, they have to be run as viable businesses because they control a lot of funding and they're responsible for a lot of people's livelihoods and not least athletes, of course. So my understanding of governance has always been that it's a means to an end. People are either put off by the term or get overexcited by the term governance, but I'm somewhere in between, despite being a professor of governance, which is that, having effective governance usually delivers better business outcomes. And I think that applies to sport as much as it does to any organization. And in fact, very fundamental for me, having a modern governance necessitates having a diverse governance as well. And I think that's something that's been overlooked in sport for far too long. We're right in the middle, of course, of a really changing environment over the representation of Black, Asian, minority ethnic people, over the representation of women. And I think really sport has let itself down in both of those regards, as regards its governance. And sometimes people assume that when you talk about diverse or inclusive governance, you're seeing it simply to have a kind of shop window of good representation that looks something like the sport that the governing body is representing. But it's not just about that. That can be important, but it's actually about delivering better outcomes, because lots of theory over governance talks about how non-inclusive governance creates a kind of collection of blind spots where you have people from the same background, from the same racial groups, from the same sex, from the same age groups. And as a result, people tend to think in the same way because their life experiences have been potentially very similar. And what you happen is you kind of mount up blind spots so that you can miss some really important things in your wing mirrors, so to speak. And when you bring different people around the table who've got different life experiences, different education, different cultural backgrounds, you tend to get more gritty interaction, as I term it, where people challenge differently, where they can offer counter perspectives to kind of established wisdoms. You get less groupthink and so on. And that's what excites me about governance generally, and sports governance particularly, is the potential to really kind of improve the governance of sport and thereby improve sport for the people it should serve. That's a really important direction of travel for me. There's no point improving governance if all you're going to do is pat yourself on the back and say, look, we've got a good, inclusive, diverse, representative board. It's about what that board then does to deliver for the athletes, the coaches, the spectators, the sponsors, everyone who's involved with that sport.
Very, very interesting, that diversity, that inclusivity, but actually then having that strategy to go out there and deliver. What examples, best practice have you seen, whether in sport, let's say, or within other sectors, in terms of good governance and diversity and inclusion being at the heart of that governance and structure?
The thing I'd always look out for in my kind of analysis of successful organizations is how self-critical are they? I've worked on quite a few boards, and I've chaired quite a few boards. I was chair of Sport Wales for 2 terms. So for 6 years, I was on the board of UK Sport, once as an independent member, and then subsequently in my role as chair of Sport Wales. And I've been involved with football for a long time, obviously. And the thing that I'm always keen to seek out is how self-critical are boards collectively about what they've done and what they are doing. So to what extent do they really look at themselves? Do they try and improve? Do they professionally develop, through gaining their own education and reaching out to organizations that are at least superficially very different to them? To what extent do they share good practice with non-sporting organizations and absorb good practice from non-sporting organizations? Because I think sport can be quite a closed sector. And I've always been disappointed about this in my experience, that sport kind of thinks that it's almost unique and it's standalone, that it can't learn from, for example, the arts or cultural organizations or SMEs or, the education world. And I think the opposite is true, actually. Good organizations take their learning from wherever they find it, not from set places. But you've got to have an appetite and a real openness and acceptance of learning to get to that position. And I'm afraid in sport over the years, I think it's become a little bit too insular. We've tended to assume that the only people who can govern sport effectively are people who've been either successful in that sport itself. So, for example, a good track and field athlete will be the only person who could possibly lead world athletics, badminton, whatever it is. And I understand some of that thinking, because I think there's a danger in going too far in the other direction, where you just bring in successful leaders, entrepreneurs, business people who don't get some of the real ethics and emotional pull of sport. But I think you need a balance. We can't just have sport run entirely by former athletes or former coaches, because A, because that would lack diversity, and B, because it would be very one-dimensional in its outlook. So I think, where there's been good practice for me, it's been about leaders in sport who've been prepared to be trenchant in their self-criticisms, who've tried to learn off others, who haven't assumed that they know it all and that all of their power is kind of absolute, that they've brought in people who are not like them. This is really fundamental to me. And when I was chair of Sport Wales, I made a real effort to bring in people to the board and to the senior executive team who weren't like me, so that we weren't a board of all, ex-athletes, or we weren't a senior management team of women who'd, worked in a certain environment. I wanted us to be eclectic and different and challenging to each other. And I think you do need to get different faces and voices around the table in order to then engineer that next stage of critique and challenge. The other thing I always look out for in organizations is how kind of creative are they, and how imaginative are they, and how ambitious are they? Because I think those 3 things go together. I think sometimes in sport, we tend to think that the parameters are already framed for us, that, if you're an Olympic sport, the 4-year cycle of Olympic funding controls all the parameters, and therefore you don't look beyond maybe 8-year cycles, because UK sport work on that basis. And I've always felt you need to be more long-sighted, more strategic, and more ambitious. So when I was chair of Sport Wales, and I wasn't responsible for this by any means, this was very much the efforts of the whole team. We came up with a really important mission for the whole organization, which we called Every Child Hooked on Sport for Life. And it sounds really kind of naive and Delphic and, kind of innocent in some ways, because we know that deep down, every single child will never be hooked on sport and stay in sport throughout their career until they're in their 80s. But as I kept saying when we were developing our strategy, if we don't aim at every child being hooked on sport for life, whether they're good at it, bad at it, just have fun, because there's a sport for everybody out there, then we're effectively surrendering some children to a life without sport. Because the minute you say most children hooked on sport for life, you know the kids that will be left out. It'll be the kids from the poorest backgrounds. It'll be kids from BAME communities. It'll be disabled children. And we weren't prepared to do that. So although it's over ambitious, it means we stretch ourselves in our strategic thinking, and we could test then our sort of twin objectives of Wales being a very successful international sporting nation, and that's obviously to do with elite and competitive sport, but equally that there was a kind of community of sport, a culture of sport that brought every child and every adult into that world, and that they enjoyed it, because, it's got to be about enjoyment at the end of the day. And you don't have to be good to enjoy something. I mean, it helps, obviously, but good is defined in the eyes of the beholder, isn't it? And children are great critics, by the way, of sport that doesn't make them feel good about themselves. They enjoy sport when it's fun, when they're acquiring new skills, and when they're doing it with their friends. All the research shows that. And the more we can really invest in that kind of sport, the more I think you can call yourself an effective and good sports organisation.
Great vision. Every child for sport for life. I want to ask one question on that. Sport is not compulsory, but school is compulsory. How important is it to have sport in school compulsory and often? Was that part of the overall thinking, and how successful were you kind of on that?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, couldn't agree more. Schools are absolutely the site in which we should invest most in sport, in my opinion. I mean, I've got 2 young girls, but I don't say it because of that. I say it because it's blindingly obvious to anybody that schools are where children acquire most of their skills. Of course, they'll acquire them outside the classroom if they've got parents who love sport, like I had, and I'm sure you had. But I mean, if you didn't have that, and if kids don't have that, then their chances of being introduced to sport and enjoying sport are much less. Therefore, the school becomes the most receptive environment for doing it. We were fortunate in Wales, and I worked quite closely on this with a really good friend of mine, who you'll all know, Baroness Tanni Gray-Thompson. Tanni chaired a task force for us in Wales about making physical literacy a kind of absolutely core component of the curriculum in Wales. And the Welsh Government, in fairness, has accepted that and has tried to integrate that in the curriculum review that will be rolled out from next year. The problem we have really is implementing what is a really good intention. You rightly point to the compulsory element of it. I think it's less about the compulsion and more about how it is assessed by the school inspections. And of course the two go together, because things don't get assessed properly unless they are compulsory or core parts of the curriculum. And that's why the two have to be wedded together. But our argument was that if you could weave physical literacy, so, the broadest physical literacy now, so children are acquiring skills and developmental skills as they progress through the school years, then you align that to physical education, to skills acquisition around school sport, whether it's at a high level, for the talented kids, or just fun for the other children, because kids will develop, won't they? They won't, they become better through their age group progression. So, you've got to look at it in that broad sense. But the problem for us has always been, how do you incentivize teachers, head teachers, to prioritize sport in schools? And my argument, and Tanni's argument in the report she wrote for the Welsh Government, was that you make it something that is inspected and reported back on to ensure that the accountability is there. So we're fortunate in Wales. PE there is a commitment to PE being a core part of the curriculum, therefore a compulsory part. And there is now, with the new curriculum, a real commitment to integrating that in an effective way and measuring it and inspecting it. But the proof of the pudding will be in the eating. Let's look at this in 5 years' time and 10 years' time and see how much we progressed as a nation. And if we have progressed as we would like to, then, I think we'll be a role model and an exemplar for other countries.
Very well put. Some great insight there. You mentioned you were chair of Sport Wales between 2010 and 2016, and similar time period as a board member of UK Sport. But you're also a board member of Stonewall, which we touched upon, inclusive culture, inclusive sport. Can you tell our global listeners a little bit about Stonewall, its goals and objectives?
So Stonewall is the principal UK charity that campaigns for the rights of LGBT plus people. It was a very significant player in the debate about equal marriage, so that people of the same sex could get married to each other. Obviously, worked very closely with the coalition government in 2010 around that agenda, and now works very very prominently on not just the rights of LGBT people, but also trans people. And I think those are important issues for sport, because clearly these are issues that probably didn't get much attention in the past, and therefore were ignored until it came to a crunch point. And I think a strategy for inclusivity really needs to think ahead and ensure that it's not discriminating against any individual, because one of sport's greatest strengths is that it's potentially there for every single person on earth, whatever their sexuality, whatever their background, whatever the color of their skin, and so on. And I think for me personally, you know, when I look at sport, I still feel disappointed that it isn't really a level playing field in terms of access. I mean, clearly competitive sport has to be, you know, much more performance focused and therefore elitist. But there isn't a level playing field even in terms of participation sport and community sport for people who are Black, Asian, minority ethnic, people who are disabled, people who are gay, people who are trans, women, girls, you know, you could go on. And we've seen really with Black Lives Matter and some of the dreadful, abhorrent abuse that Black footballers and Black athletes have experienced, particularly over the last few months, to know that, you know, all is not right in sport. And I think we need to, again, back to my point about where we learn, we need to take advice really from as many organizations that can, you know, hold our feet to the fire, so to speak, you know, can say to us, you know, how well are you actually doing on this agenda? You know, how well are you making, how inclusive are you making your sport for LGBT plus people? How accessible is your sport for people with a disability? You know, have you thought about whether girls are experiencing your sport in the same way as boys? And if you know they aren't, what are you doing about it? I mean, this is semi-facetious, Nigel, but I will say it. You know, whenever I've pushed organizations to absolutely prioritize girls' sport, for example, and they say, well, to do that would be unfair to our boys' program in whatever sport it is. And as I say to them, if you turned your budget completely into girls' sport for 5 years, it wouldn't compensate for centuries of neglect that women's sport and girls' sport has had. So, you know, you turn it on its head. In a sense, now is the time to actually pump prime and prioritize, and in American terms, affirmative action, positive action in UK terms, in favor of groups that really have been discriminated against in sport. So yes, it might be difficult, you know, it might be a difficult decision for the board to prioritize a BAME agenda or a disabled agenda in their sport and put money where their mouths are. But quite frankly, you know, boys and men's sport has had the lion's share of funding for so long that it's about redressing an imbalance as well.
You mentioned Black Lives Matter and the abhorrent abuse in recent months of a number of Black football players. My question here is, football has that kind of that problem, does their front page, back page, and all the social media. But really, has football got the power to also change society? Part quote Nelson Mandela.
Well, if any sport has, it's football. I have to say. I mean, you know, we can all agree, can't we, that football is probably the most single powerful sport globally. I mean, the reach of FIFA and obviously in Europe, UEFA, the status of the game in the public consciousness, the emotion and attachment that people have all over the world for their local teams, never mind, you know, the famous big hitter teams, and just the kind of international game, FIFA World Cups, UEFA European Championships. They are massive, massive global events. But aside from all of that, it's one of the simplest games that virtually anybody can play. You need a spherical object, whatever that's made up of, and a couple of jumpers to put down for goalposts. So, in a sense, football is the easiest game to play. And that's part of its appeal, isn't it? That anyone can do it in any environment, in any space, effectively. And I think that puts a big responsibility on all of us who work in football. We are the biggest sport. We have the biggest reach, and therefore we need to do more with our potential and with our assets. And I think all of us who work in football, I know this from hearing people like Gianni Infantino and Alexander Sheffirin at UEFA, and I know how passionate they are about trying to properly address issues of racism and sexism and homophobia in sport. And they're not easy things to address because these are societal issues as well. But in a sense, we've got to take some bigger responsibility than other sports in this regard, because, we have more Black athletes, we have more female athletes now with the growth of women's football, and we simply can't sit on our hands whilst those athletes get such dreadful, awful abuse as they currently do.
And we all hope that change happens, and change happens now, or should have changed yesterday. But you mentioned FIFA, you mentioned UEFA, so world football, and that takes me to my next topic. Laura, you're Deputy Chair of the Women's Football Committee at UEFA. You're the board member at the Welsh Football Trust and have been since 2008. You're now standing for candidate for UEFA election to the FIFA Council this year, 2021. So 2 questions, Laura, and I'm sure you've been asked this a lot recently. Why? But more importantly, what is your manifesto?
Okay, they're fairly straightforward questions to answer, Nigel. I've been involved in football all my life as a player. I played for Wales 24 times, which, by the way, was every game that Wales played during the period of my career, because women's football was much less advanced then. I was captain of my country. As soon as I hung up my boots, mainly to concentrate on my academic career, I was pretty clear that I probably wouldn't go down a coaching route because of my other professional interests. And it seemed obvious to me that I should try and put something back into my sport. And I did feel I had something to offer, with my governance background. So I've been involved in the governance of football since I retired, with the Welsh FA, obviously, and more recently with UEFA. And those football anoraks amongst your audience will know that I did try to stand for this same election back in 2016, but was prevented due to the British vice presidency rule. And I'm really grateful to the Football Association of Wales, and indeed all the UEFA nations, for supporting a change to that regulation, which means that we were allowed to contest the election now for the women's place from UEFA onto FIFA Council this coming April. So the reason I want to do it, I think, is quite simple. I think I can make a contribution. I'd be the first European international who's been captain of a country to sit on FIFA Council. So I know the game inside out, and not just the women's game. I've been involved in all aspects of boys and men's football as well. I'm a strategic thinker when it comes to the game. I like planning a really ambitious strategy. And I know how the game's pieces, the jigsaw pieces of the game, fit together. So I've worked at grassroots level. I'm passionate about children's football and school football, but I know as well as an ex-player, just where the potential obstacles are in the pathway to become an elite player as well. So I think I can bring something to the table. And I've never really done anything in my career unless I feel I can make an active contribution, and unless I think my voice will carry some weight and some receptiveness, because I don't think there's much point campaigning to have women on FIFA Council or indeed on UEFA Exco unless you have women who can speak for the game with authority, with knowledge, with a degree of expertise. And I hope that that's my profile, and that the UEFA nations will look at me and think I can be a really strong voice for them around the table in FIFA. So that's the main reason why I'm doing it. In terms of my campaign and my manifesto, I mean, the elections in April, we're in the process of meeting what we hope will be every single one of the other 54 UEFA nations. I've met lots of them already, and we're receiving a really positive and productive response from them. My manifesto, I think, would be relatively simple. We're working on it at the moment, but we know what we want to say. I'm a football candidate, as I said a moment ago, so I'm immersed in the game. I've grown up in the game. I'm a total football anorak who can happily spend all her waking hours either watching the game or reading about it. So I love the game. You know, it's in my heart. My two girls play the game as well. I still play vets football now, not as well as I used to for obvious reasons. So I think that aspect of my manifesto is pretty clear. I'm a football candidate. I'm also somebody who I hope will fit into the zeitgeist of FIFA and UEFA at the moment, which is that we recognise we need to modernise, we need to change, we need to become more diverse, we need to reform the governance of our sport to make it deliver more. Football is a game for everyone at the end of the day, and if we're not delivering equally for everyone, then I think we're not doing what we are there to actually do. That's really important principle. So, you know, I'll be standing on a manifesto of contributing towards that change process that Gianni Infantino and Alexander Schäferin are already driving forward. My background around diversity is very clear, so I'll be emphasizing some of that, how important it is to get a diverse governance structure so that you deliver better for the people you serve. You would expect me to be able to say something about women's football, having been an international player and somebody involved in the governance of the game. I think there's something more fundamental about women's football, which is this is where the real room for growth is. We know that the game is growing much faster than the boys' game and the men's game because there's so much headroom above it. And that will bring with it really unique opportunities, not just for participation, but for coaching, for sponsorship, for the corporate side, for the growth of the FIFA Women's World Cup, and indeed the UEFA Women's Champions League. All of those things are really important, and I'm across them, obviously, with my involvement in UEFA and in the domestic scene in Wales and beyond. And then finally, I think, and this is a really important ethical issue for me, I think we have to have what I know has been referred to by Alexander Schäferin as competitive balance. As we grow the game in Europe and indeed in the world, we can't leave countries behind. You know, we've got to make sure that everyone comes on this journey with us, whether it's for the women's game, whether it's for children's football, whether it's for social inclusion, or whether it's for the elite game. You know, we can't afford to let some countries, clubs, whatever, advance so fast they leave behind a big gulf between them and the rest of football. I think competitive balance is the way the game grows for everybody in a way that benefits everybody. And I think that's a really, really important principle. And all of that, by the way, is underpinned by my values, which are anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic. And I think the values are fundamental. You know, you have to stand on a values platform if you want to be a leader and contribute in football. And I think we need to look to do even more on all of those agendas. You know, racism, as we said a moment ago, continues to blight our sport, and we can't afford to let it continue. We have to address these issues really head on now. And that, in essence, will be the basis of my manifesto.
Well, Laura, we wish you all the best. You've got strong principles and values. And just one more question on this area, and it's on women's and girls football. How do you see that developing in the next decade in a global context?
It's a really difficult question to answer because there are so many different dimensions to that, Nigel. I think we'll see a huge growth in the elite end, the competitive or performance end of women's football. We'll see growth in the UEFA Women's Champions League, of course, which we're already seeing, really successful tournament held in a centralized model last year, mainly because of COVID, of course. But, you know, 3.4 million people watched that, I think. And we're seeing sort of 4 times the participation growth of the boys' game in Europe at the moment for girls football. So there's clear headroom. So I'd like to see that continue. But I think we've also got to look at those countries where women's football is really in its infancy. And there are countries like that in Europe, it's not just in other continents. And we need to give them a helping hand. It's not just about money, it's about sharing know-how and coaching and resourcing, and really all of us acting as role models and mentors to countries which are just beginning on their women's football journey. Because it's back to my point, really, the chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And if we're going to grow the game globally at FIFA level, we need to bring some of the countries where women's football is less well developed. I think as well as that, that there are some really exciting developments that are likely to happen around separating out the rights and sponsorship rights and corporate rights for the Women's World Cup from the Men's World Cup, which I know is underway. I think personally, when it comes to bids for Women's World Cups, I think that should be a member association decision, as it is for the Men's World Cup, so that everybody gets a say in deciding where the next World Cup goes. That's really important, I think, because obviously we've got Australia, New Zealand joint bid in 2023. I think that would be a wonderful tournament, by the way, knowing what great sporting nations Australia and New Zealand are. But I think then when we look ahead beyond that, the tournament is going to grow at pace, really exponentially. And we're really going to need to have all of the member associations making the decision about where that goes. And legacy is so significant. I mean, I bang on about this all the time. Ask my colleagues in UEFA Women's Football Committee. For me, there should be no major event without really good inheritance of legacy. So, let's see what it'll bring to that region. Even if it's an under-19s UEFA tournament or 17s or anything really, there should be a real resonance in terms of legacy for ordinary girls, particularly in that community and in that nation. So I think all of those things are really, really fundamental. But actually, it goes back to the debate we had earlier, Nigel, which is about schools. Schools remain the site of biggest potential for the growth of the girls' game for me, because if we can get girls to play in schools, learn the skills to be footballers in and around a school environment, then I think we're making the job easier for clubs and then for the pathway beyond that. And it doesn't all have to lead to elite. I think football can be played at every level with every ability. And that's what makes it such an incredibly wonderful sport.
Really interesting. Laura, you mentioned the flagship World Cup tournament. The FIFA World Cup 2030, British and Irish bid hasn't been declared so far officially. Where are we on the planning, Laura?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the best person to ask about that, in that I haven't been right at the heart of that. But I think it's really encouraging that the British and Irish, UK and Irish associations have been liaising very closely about a possible bid. And obviously, this will be very dependent on the governments of each of those countries wanting to back it. And I very much hope they will. I think this would be absolutely wonderful to have a FIFA World Cup back on British and Irish soil. I mean, clearly the last one was in England in 1966. The game's moved on a lot since then. Football in Scotland, Northern Ireland, Republic Wales has grown exponentially since then. We're all decent players in the global football scene. I mean, my own country, of course, your listeners will know, got to the semi-finals of the Euros last time, the best performing British nation. And I think, there's potential for smaller nations like Wales and Scotland and Ireland and Northern Ireland to surprise people in major tournaments, because we've got some great players. Everybody's heard of Gareth Bale and Aaron Ramsey and so on, but we've got some really top players in each of the home nations. So I think, let's not prejudice other bids, because there will be other European bids, never mind bids from other continents. But I think whatever happens, if we're in the position to fire the starting gun, a joint bid between the Irish and UK associations will be a very, very strong one. And I think that would be really exciting for football on these islands.
Probably 3.5 years away until an announcement in 2024. So every country, every nation, every joint bid still has plenty of time. Laura, now just a couple of questions, a little bit out of the box, which I ask every guest. First one, if you could turn back the time and talk to your 18-year-old self, what would you tell her?
don't take this the wrong way, and it's not a contradiction. I probably wouldn't tell her much, and the reason I say that is I think you've got to make your own mistakes in your career, and it's very easy looking back now and seeing a whole catalogue of mistakes I've made in my career, professionally and personally, because that's life, isn't it? You make wrong decisions, or something doesn't work out as you would have hoped it would. But that's the learning process I was talking about earlier. I think sport is a really good exemplar of this. I think most athletes and sports people, I know I do, learn more from mistakes than they do from successes. I think we tend to be quite self-critical as athletes. And, we've been brought up in that environment of being coached and being developed and being pushed. And therefore, things that go less well, we tend to learn more from. And so in a perverse kind of way, I probably wouldn't say anything to my 18-year-old self other than go out and make the mistakes, but make sure you learn from them. Every single thing you've done less well or wrong, or, ballsed it up, for one of a more colloquial term, think about what happened, what you can take out of it, and what you can remedy in order not to make that same mistake again. So I think, this idea, and I know you're asking it as a tongue-in-cheek question, but this idea that you could ever give advice to an 18-year-old is nonsensical anyway, because we all think we know our own minds at 18, don't we? We all think we know it all, really.
No, very well put, Laura. And second question on this: if you could have dinner with any two people, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
I'm actually going to choose two people who are outside football, just because my point earlier was that we need to really broaden our horizons and learn from people who are not in our sectors as well. So one of them is in sport, the other one isn't. The one in sport would be Irene Steer, who a lot of your listeners and viewers might not have heard of, but she's somebody that I've thought a lot about over the last decade, because Irene Steer was the first Welsh woman to win a gold medal at an Olympics back in 1912, I think in the Stockholm Olympics. And she was part of the 4x100 relay team in the pool, freestyle in the pool. And what's fascinating about Irene Steer is not just that she was the first woman, because at that time, a lot of Olympic events were completely closed to women. As you know, swimming wasn't even permitted until, I think that was the first year women swimmers were entered into the Olympics. But because she actually had no privileged background in terms of swimming, she used to swim and practice in Roath Park Lake, which is a big lake in the centre of Cardiff. And it's pretty grubby, believe me, in terms of, water quality. But she used to just jump in the lake and swim across it to practice. And I think the reason I'd be fascinated to have a dinner conversation with her is that I'd love to know, what her motivations were, why it became so important to her that she could compete like men in an Olympics, and how she was driven without any of the kind of infrastructure of training provision and coaches and strength and conditioning and all the stuff that we had later as athletes. It'd be fascinating just to hear from her about her inner motivation and why she was so passionate about representing Wales and becoming the first woman to win a gold medal. And by the way, she was the first woman. It took us probably the best part of another century for a second woman to win a gold medal, and that was Nicole Cook in the cycling road race in 2008, which, by the way, is one of my all-time favorite sporting moments. And it shows for small countries, like Wales, getting gold medals in Olympics, people like Jay Jones in Taekwondo subsequently, are such iconic moments, really. And they inspire generations of kids to take up Taekwondo, to jump in the pool, to get on a bike and so on. And I think she'd definitely be up there, with one of my most interesting dinner guests. And the other one, who's another woman, you'd expect me to name women because I think by and large women have been ignored in history, whether that's sporting history or political and social history, is a woman called Elizabeth Andrews. And again, your listeners might not have heard of her, but they should have, because she was a suffragist. She was involved with a lot of the campaigns after the First World War to ensure that women won the vote. And she brought Emily Pankhurst to Wales to speak to audiences. But she was a very ordinary woman who grew up in the Rhondda Valleys and was motivated mostly by poverty and by injustice, and particularly towards children and women. And I could recite a whole load of incredible things that Elizabeth Andrews achieved, politically, socially, morally, educationally. But the big one for me, and anyone across the world who comes from a mining area, as I do, will recognize this, was Elizabeth Andrews was responsible for the development of pithead baths. So the showers at the top of the mines where miners could come out covered in coal dust and shower there. Now, you might say, what's the big deal about that? Well, I'll tell you the big deal, and it's very significant for children and women. Prior to that, miners used to go home, and it would often be 3 sons and a father. Women had to boil water on a stove in order for them to bathe in a tin or iron bath. They often died of scalding injuries. They often lost children during pregnancy by carrying baths of hot water for their families. And basically, it confined them to staying at home all day in order to create the conditions by which miners could then bath when they came home. So a very practical example of something massively, massively significant. And Elizabeth Andrews is one of the women who really has been ignored by history. I hope not for too long, because we're campaigning for a statue to be built of Elizabeth. But she would be a fascinating dinner party guest, because she'd be able to talk about how a practical issue like pithead baths became such a significant progress issue for women and for children at home. And those are the kind of things that I'm really interested in politically.
Laura, really well put. I mean, this is part of ISC Women's Week. So 2 fantastic and inspirational women for a dinner for 3 with, of course, yourself, Laura. Laura, you've had a great and diverse career, player, academic, boardroom. What is your advice to the next generation of sport business professionals coming into the industry?
Well, I think I'd probably say set yourself really high ambitions and believe you can do it. None of it will be easy, and you'll have knockbacks and setbacks along the way, but don't be put off by those. Be prepared to get back up again, dust yourself down and go again. So be ambitious. Don't just get what will look like a good job in sport and sit there for 20 years. You'll probably look back on your career then and wish you'd made a move a little bit earlier. For women particularly, but also for some men, but particularly for women, apply for jobs before you're 100% ready to do them. I think that's really important. I mean, I've applied for jobs and got them when I'm clear that I might not be able to do every aspect of them, but we know that women are reluctant to do that generally, and men, in fairness, some men too fall into that trap. Surround yourself with good people, and don't listen to too much criticism. It's important to be self-reflexive, of course, and self-critical. But, there's always somebody out there to get you, mainly because, it's a small field and somebody's after your position and your job mostly. So only listen to people you trust, but get people who will watch your back. And actually, I think it's incumbent on all of us who are leaders in sport in any shape or form to also look after the backs of people around us, make sure that they are developed and they're mentored and they have a support system to grow in the job, because that benefits us all in sport. Nothing makes me angrier than seeing women and men pull up the ladder behind them when they get to a leadership position, or assume that because it was tough for them, then it should be tough for the next generation. It shouldn't. We're generationally there to help each other. So, no woman should go through some of the, outright sexism that I experienced earlier in my career, because we hope things will change. And if they're not changing, I hope that people like myself who've got some degree of voice can reach out a hand and talk to women about how to deal with it. So I think it's about that, but don't lose the ambition, and don't set your targets too low. Much better to reach for the sky and fall a little bit short than to, reach for 6 foot above you and achieve it easily. Sport needs to be about big aspirations and big ambitions, and about making it for everyone, and not letting it become a closed shop.
You're very inspirational, Laura, and again, thank you for sharing that fantastic advice, not just to me, but everyone listening. It's nearly full time, so my final question is, and you've kind of answered this throughout our discussion, but What does sport mean to you?
Well, I guess I've conveyed it, I hope. I'm very, very passionate about sport. It's something that I've cared about more than anything in my professional life. And although I'm an academic first and foremost, and I don't actually work full time in sport, it's been an enormous part of my life from start to finish. You know, I grew up as a football mad toddler to playing for my country. And if you told me that when I was maybe 10 or 11, and it was firmly established as my goal, I don't think I would have ever really believed you that could have happened. I'm now standing for, election to one of the most powerful organizations in sport. And I hope I'm successful in that election. But even if I'm not, I'll carry on my commitment to working within football because I care so much about it. I know what it's brought me as a person and my family and my children. And I want other people to experience that. I don't want people to be excluded, and I don't want people not to have experienced the benefits and the joys and the fun of sport. So, whatever happens, I hope next time I speak to you, I will be on FIFA Council. But if that's not the case, you can rest assured I'll still be doing something in football because, sport and football mean so much to me personally.
We'll definitely do a part 2, Laura, when you're on the FIFA Council. Laura McAllister, thank you for sharing your energy, experience and expertise with the International Sports Convention.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.